Some kings rule through fear, others through gold. Captain Grim Valerius, the undisputed sovereign of the Ashen Sea, ruled through a much more potent and far more terrifying weapon: absolute indifference. He was a force of nature, a man who had conquered his empire, not with fiery passion, but with the cold, calculating precision of a winter frost. He took ships, islands, and fortunes with a quiet efficiency that was more chilling than any battle cry. His heart, the whispers in every tavern claimed, was a dead stone in his chest, incapable of joy, of rage, of anything. He was a king surrounded by trembling subjects, a master of a game he had long since grown tired of winning. But even a bored king needs to secure his borders. The island of Silverfall, a jewel of trade and prosperity, was the final crucial piece on his chessboard. Its governor, a proud man who had defied him for years, was finally broken. Valerius's terms were not for gold or territory. He already had enough of both. His price was a symbol, a consolidation of power. He demanded the governor's only daughter, Arden, in marriage. A beautiful, celebrated prize to be added to his collection. He expected a weeping, terrified girl. He expected another victory, another exercise in the soul-crushing boredom of absolute power. He had no idea he was about to make the one move that would finally make the game interesting again. Arden of Silverfall was not a prize to be won. She was a blade sharpened in secret. While her father, the governor, presented her to the world as a delicate rose, in private, he had forged her into a weapon. Paranoid and surrounded by enemies, he had ensured his heir was anything but helpless. He had hired disgraced strategists to teach her the art of war, and a silent master of blades to teach her the art of death. She agreed to the marriage, her face a perfect mask of tragic duty to save her people from the pirates' wrath. But as she stood on the deck of the Reaper's shadow, watching her home disappear into the mist, she made a silent vow. She would be his wife, she would be his queen, but she would never, ever be his possession. The wedding was a somber affair, a funeral for a maiden's freedom. Arden wore a gown of silver silk, a stark contrast to the dark, blood-stained wood of the pirate ship. Valerius stood beside her, a statue carved from shadow and ice, his face an unreadable mask. His crew, a legion of scarred killers, watched in silence, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They knew their captain. They knew his coldness, his utter lack of passion. They were witnessing not a union, but the acquisition of a beautiful, breathing treasure. That night, when he entered the captain's cabin, he found her waiting. The room was a testament to his conquests, opulent, filled with priceless artifacts, yet sterile and cold. Arden stood by the large, unmade bed, a vision in white silk, her back to him. He expected tears. He expected trembling. He walked toward her, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, the only noise in the heavy silence. "The charade is over," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, devoid of emotion. "You know what is expected of you." Arden turned slowly, and the look in her eyes was not fear, it was fire. In one fluid, impossibly fast motion, a motion that spoke of years of secret training, a silver dagger appeared in her hand. Before he could even register the movement, she had closed the distance between them, the point of the dagger pressed firmly against the hollow of his throat. "Let me be clear, husband. You have bought my alliance. You have bought my name. You have not bought my body. You will sleep in this bed, and I will sleep in it. But if you ever try to touch me without my permission, this wedding night will be your last." The air in the cabin crackled with tension. Any other man, pirate or king, would have reacted with rage, with violence. Any of his crew would have backhanded her for such insolence. But Valerius did something else. He did something no living soul on his ship had ever seen him do. He looked down at the blade at his throat, then up into her blazing, defiant eyes, and a slow,
quiet, utterly genuine smile spread across his face. It was not a smirk. It was not a sneer. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated delight. The frost around his eyes seemed to crack, revealing a flicker of a long-extinguished fire. "Interesting," he murmured, the sound a low, appreciative rumble in his chest. The smile widened. "Very interesting." He made no move to disarm her. He simply stood there, the point of her dagger dimpling his skin, looking at her as if he were seeing the sun for the first time after a lifetime of darkness. He had expected a pawn. He had found a queen. He had expected a boring, predictable night of conquest. Instead, she had declared war. And for the first time in a decade, Captain Grim Valerius felt a genuine, thrilling spark of life. The game was finally afoot.
The dagger remained pressed against his throat for a long, charged silence. Arden's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand was rock steady. She had thrown her one and only card onto the table. This moment would define her entire existence on this ship, a life of defiance or a life of subjugation. She had prepared for his rage, for a brutal struggle. She had not, in all her strategic planning, prepared for his smile. It was a smile that changed the entire geometry of the room. It was not the cruel smirk of a predator toying with its prey. It was a smile of genuine, startling admiration. It reached his eyes, those cold gray seas, and for a moment she saw not a frost, but a flicker of a forgotten warmth, like embers stirred in a long-dead fire. "And what?" he finally said, his voice a low, amused purr, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you propose we do now, my dear, deadly wife?" The question disarmed her more effectively than any physical move could have. He was not fighting her. He was engaging her, playing her game. "You will give me your word," she said, her voice regaining its steel, "that you will not touch me without my consent." "And if I do not?" he challenged, the smile never wavering. "You will kill me? And what then? My crew will tear you to pieces before my body is cold. You would trade one night of unpleasantness for an eternity of agony, a poor strategic move for someone who clearly understands strategy." He was right, and the fact that he saw her as a strategist, not just a hysterical woman, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Then we have a stalemate," she said. "Do we?" he murmured. He slowly, deliberately raised his hand, not to her blade, but to her face. She flinched, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. He said, softly, "I think that we have a beginning." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "I give you my word, Arden. I will not touch you without your consent." He drew back, his smile turning into something more complex, something possessive. "But I will make you want my touch, and that, my queen, is a promise." With that, he stepped back, giving her space. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, more dangerous tension had taken its place. She slowly lowered the dagger, her mind racing. He had not just neutralized her threat, he had transformed it into the opening move of an entirely new game, a game of seduction and willpower. That night set the precedent for their bizarre marriage. They shared the massive captain's bed, a vast ocean of silk sheets between them. But he kept his word. He never touched her. Yet his presence was a constant, unnerving pressure. He was a creature of habit and discipline. He rose before the dawn, his movements silent and precise. She would lie awake, pretending to be asleep, listening to him dress, to the soft clink of his buckles, the whisper of leather as he strapped on his weapons. Their days were a silent war of observation. He did not confine her to the cabin. She had the freedom of the ship, a privilege that made her both a queen and a target. The crew watched her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They had all heard whispers of what happened on the wedding night, the girl who had put a blade to the captain's throat and lived.
Some saw her as a witch who had enchanted their grim leader. Others saw her as a spark of rebellion, a dangerous variable in their predictable world. Arden ignored them. Her focus was solely on Valerius. She studied him, learning his habits, his moods, the men he trusted, the ones he despised. She discovered he was not just a pirate, he was a brilliant administrator. His empire ran with the efficiency of a navy. His trade routes were meticulously planned. His intel was flawless. He was a king in every sense of the word. And he, in turn, studied her. He would find her in the ship's small, neglected library, poring over books of history and philosophy. He would see her on the deck, her eyes on the horizon, not with the longing of a prisoner, but with the analytical gaze of a navigator. He started leaving things for her to find, a complex cipher on his desk, to see if she could solve it. She could. A book on naval strategy left open to a chapter on famous blockades. She left a note in the margin, pointing out a flaw in the historical admiral's logic. Their interactions were a duel of intellects. He would challenge her opinions on trade routes. She would counter with insights into the politics of the merchant guilds. They argued, they debated, they sharpened their minds against each other, and in doing so, a grudging, dangerous respect began to grow between them. She began to see the brilliant, lonely mind behind the fearsome reputation. He began to see the fierce, capable woman behind the beautiful face. The first crack in her own armor came not from him, but from his crew. A group of disgruntled pirates, led by a brutish officer who resented her influence, decided to test the limits of the captain's new infatuation. They cornered her on the lower deck, their intentions clear. Arden was not helpless. She drew the dagger she now always carried, her training taking over. She could handle them, but she was outnumbered. Just as the first man lunged, a shadow fell over them. Valerius. He had not moved quickly, he had simply appeared. His face was devoid of its usual amusement. It was a flat, dead calm which was infinitely more terrifying than any rage. "He is your queen," he said, his voice quiet, conversational. "On your knees." The men hesitated, looking at each other, their bravado faltering. "Now," Valerius said, and the word was not a command. It was a sentence. The men fell to their knees. He walked past them and stopped in front of Arden. He gently took the dagger from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The brief touch sent a jolt through her. He looked at the blade, then back at her. He said, softly, "You won't be needing this." Then he turned back to the kneeling men. "She is the queen of this ship. Her word is my word. Her safety is my safety. The next man to forget that will learn what it feels like to breathe water." He walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding. He had not just saved her, he had publicly declared her his equal. He had tied her fate, her power, directly to his own. The line between captor and consort had just been irrevocably blurred, and as she looked at his retreating back, Arden felt a new, terrifying emotion stir within her, a flicker of gratitude. It was a weakness she couldn't afford, a chink in her own armor that he, with his keen predator's instinct, would surely find.
The public declaration of her status changed everything. Arden was no longer just the captain's wife. She was the queen of the Reaper's shadow. And the crew, ever pragmatic, adapted quickly. Fear of the captain's cold wrath was a powerful motivator. The whispers and hostile glares were replaced by bowed heads and grudging respect. But this new power was a double-edged sword. It solidified her position, but it also tied her more deeply to Valerius, blurring the lines of their adversarial game. The intellectual sparring between them continued, but the tone began to shift. It became less of a duel and more of a collaboration. He started genuinely seeking her counsel. He would unroll a new chart on his great table, not as a test, but as a problem to be solved together. "The merchant guilds are forming a new alliance," he would say. "They are closing the Straits of Kithra. What would you do?" Arden, unable to resist a strategic puzzle, would dive in. They would spend hours debating, their minds moving in a complex, exhilarating dance. She would challenge his ruthlessness with logic, arguing that a stable trade partner was more profitable in the long run than a plundered one. He in turn would temper her idealism with the harsh realities of his world, reminding her that in the Ashen Sea, mercy was a weakness that would get you killed. They were forging not just strategies, but a shared philosophy, a kingdom of two. The physical space between them, that vast ocean in their bed, began to feel less like a truce line and more like a charged, empty void. The awareness of each other was a constant hum beneath the surface of their days. She was intensely aware of the scent of him, sea salt, old leather, and something uniquely his own. He was aware of the sound of her breathing in the quiet of the night, a soft rhythm that had become the new metronome of his life. The first time he touched her with true intent, it was not an act of passion, but of comfort. A terrible storm had descended upon them, a shrieking monster of wind and water that tossed the mighty ship like a child's toy. Arden, for all her training, had never experienced the full, untamed fury of the open ocean. She was trying to hide her fear, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the bed, when a particularly violent lurch sent a heavy chest sliding across the floor, straight towards her. Valerius moved with the same fluid speed she'd seen on their wedding night. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides, his body shielding hers as he stopped the chest with his leg. The storm raged outside, but in that moment the cabin was preternaturally still. He was kneeling on the floor beside the bed, his face level with hers. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes. "The sea is a cruel mistress," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the howl of the wind. And then he did something that shattered her defenses. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the bedspread. His hand was large, warm, and calloused, a stark contrast to her own. It was not a lover's touch, nor a captor's. It was the touch of an anchor in a storm, a gesture of pure, unadulterated reassurance. But this ship has weathered worse, and so will you. He held her hand for a long moment, the simple contact, a profound intimacy in their unspoken world. The fear inside her didn't vanish, but it was joined by a new, strange warmth. It was the first time she had felt safe since stepping aboard his ship. The storm eventually passed, leaving a calm, star-dusted night in its wake, but the storm inside the cabin had only just begun. The touch had broken a seal. The unspoken rules of their game had been rewritten. The next evening, the silence between them was different. It was no longer the silence of a stalemate, but the silence of anticipation. He was standing by the stern window looking out at the sea. "You are not what I expected," he said, without turning. "Neither are you," she replied, her voice soft. He turned to face her, his eyes dark and intense in the lantern light. "I took you as a prize, Arden, a symbol to break your father's pride. It was a cold political move. That is all it was meant to be." "And now?" she whispered, her heart aching with a hope she didn't dare to name. "And now," he said, taking a step toward her, "you are the only thing on this ship that makes any sense. You are the only thing that is not boring." He took another step. "You challenge me. You infuriate me. You make me think. You make me feel." He stopped just before her, the space between them electric. He slowly raised his hand, not to her face, but to the silver dagger that she still wore at her hip. He wrapped his fingers around the hilt, his knuckles brushing against her silk dress. "On our wedding night," he murmured, his voice a low hypnotic rasp, "you offered me a threat." His thumb stroked the pommel of the blade. "Tonight, I am offering you a choice." He looked deep into her eyes, and the grim smiling captain was gone. In his place was just a man, raw and vulnerable.
"You have my word," he whispered. "But do I have your consent?" The question hung in the air, more powerful than any command he had ever given. This was not about a debt, or a treaty, or a kingdom. This was about them. She looked at this impossible man, her captor, her king, her intellectual sparring partner, her protector. And she realized that her vow to never be his possession had been fulfilled in the most unexpected way. He wasn't trying to possess her. He was offering her the one thing she thought she had lost forever: a choice. She didn't answer with words. She simply reached up and placed her hand over his on the dagger, a silent surrender that was also a total victory.
That night, the ocean between them in the captain's bed finally vanished. Their coming together was not the violent conquest she had once feared, but a collision of two powerful, lonely souls who had finally found their equal. It was a raw, desperate, and surprisingly tender exploration, a silent conversation in a language their minds had been speaking for months. In the quiet aftermath, lying in his arms, Arden realized a terrifying and exhilarating truth. She was in love with her captor. And worse, she was beginning to feel that the grim king of the Ashen Sea was in love with her. Their new, fragile intimacy transformed the ship. The unspoken tension that had kept the crew on edge was replaced by a quiet, focused energy. They had a true queen now, and her presence had not made their captain weak, but stronger, more focused. The smiles they had once seen on his face were no longer a shocking anomaly. They were a quiet, constant presence whenever he looked at her. But peace, in their world, was a fleeting thing. A ghost from Valerius's past, a rival pirate named Marcus Thorn, a man whose entire family Valerius had destroyed to claim his throne, had been biding his time. He saw the stories of the captain's new bride not as a sign of strength, but as a fatal, exploitable weakness. He knew Valerius. He knew the cold, unfeeling man he had once been. This new woman, Thorn reasoned, must be the key to his undoing. The attack came not on the high seas, but at Silverfall. Thorn, a master of infiltration, sacked the island while the Reaper's shadow was on a diplomatic mission Arden herself had orchestrated. He took the governor, her father, hostage. The message sent to Valerius was simple and brutal: a life for a life. Your wife for her father. The news hit Valerius like a cannonball. Arden saw the old, grim mask slam back into place. The cold, emotionless king returned, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "This is my fight," he said, his voice flat. "You will remain on the ship where you are safe." "Like hell I will," Arden retorted, her own fire blazing. "That is my father. That is my home. You think I will sit here while you fight my battle? I am your queen, Valerius, not a piece of cargo to be protected. We do this together." For the first time, they had a real fight. Not a battle of wits, but an argument born of love and fear. He was terrified of losing her, the one thing that had brought color back into his gray world. She was terrified he would revert to the monster he used to be, sacrificing himself out of a misplaced sense of guilt. In the end, her iron will won. They would face Thorn together. The final confrontation was a masterpiece of their combined strategic minds. They used Thorn's arrogance against him, luring him into a naval battle in a narrow strait where his larger fleet was at a disadvantage. But the final move was a personal one. Valerius and Arden boarded Thorn's flagship alone, a high-stakes gamble to rescue her father. The duel between Valerius and Thorn was a brutal, bloody affair, a culmination of years of hatred. But while they fought, Arden executed her own plan. She rescued her father, but as they were escaping, Thorn, in a final act of spite, aimed a pistol not at Valerius, but at her. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The flash of the pan, the roar of the pistol. Valerius screamed her name, but he was too far away. Arden closed her eyes, ready for the impact. It never came. When she opened her eyes, Valerius was still standing,
but Thorn was on the ground, a look of shock on his face, a dagger in his chest. Standing over him was Arden's father, his face grim. The governor, the man Valerius had once broken, had saved the life of the pirate who had stolen his daughter. In the quiet of the aftermath, on the deck of the Reaper's Shadow, the governor looked at his daughter, and then at the pirate king who stood beside her, his arm protectively around her. He saw not a captor and a victim, but two equals. He said, "I gave him a prize, but it seems she has claimed a kingdom of her own." He gave them his blessing, choosing to remain on Silverfall to rebuild. As the Reaper's Shadow sailed away, Arden stood at the helm, her hand resting over Valerius's on the wheel. Their journey had begun with a threat, a dagger on a wedding night, but it had led them to this, a shared throne, a shared future. These are the kinds of epic love stories that become legends, the tales we seek out again and again. And if you want to be sure you're there when the next great legend is told, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you'll always have a place on our crew for the next adventure.